Today, I'd like to talk to you about what is our new normal in thinking about vaccines, especially at a time of SARS-CoV-2, where vaccines have become something that is being discussed all over the world. So what about vaccines? What about resilience? What are the lessons we've learned? And what really does the future hold, not only for this pandemic, but for pandemics in the future? So if we look at 2020, 2020 was the year where we had the most fires in the world, whether it was the west coast of the US, as shown here, or the Amazon or Australia. We had forests burning everywhere, old growth and new growth forests. It was also the year where we lost one of the largest ice shelves in the Arctic. 2020 tied the record for the hottest ever year. We had bleaching of coral reefs like we've seen all too often in the past few decades. It was also the year of the emergence of a new coronavirus, now known as SARS coronavirus 2. This was not unexpected. The number and diversity of outbreaks has increased over the past 30 years. We have an alphabet from AIDS to Zika of viruses that have crossed from animals into humans. And with increasing trade, travel, population density, human displacement, migration, deforestation, and climate change, we are in a new era with the risk for epidemics and, as we are seeing, pandemics. This is not new to us. Our last pandemic was in 2009, and our last public health emergency of international concern before Zika was Ebola. In 2014, 2015, Ebola affected West Africa, urban West Africa. It had a direct cost of about $4 billion US and a total cost of $54 billion. It destroyed health systems, and in addition to the direct damage that Ebola did, killing many people, it also resulted in damage that continues to affect West Africa now. Ebola has a mortality rate of 60%. Measles has a mortality rate of less than 2%. We have a very effective measles vaccine, but because of the disruption caused by Ebola, more children have died of measles in Ebola-affected countries than have people who acquired Ebola itself. For Ebola in 2014, there were solutions available. The outbreaks of Ebola have been occurring since 1976. They tended to occur in small numbers, be restricted to villages, and by ensuring that those villages did not come in contact with other locations, it was possible to contain the size of the outbreaks. It was only when Ebola came into urban centers in West Africa that we started to see then tens of thousands of cases. Now, it wasn't like there wasn't tools available for Ebola. A vaccine had been developed as the Public Health Agency of Canada's National Microbiology Laboratory. It had been tested in animals. It had been licensed to a company in the US. But that vaccine was not taken forward into development because no one could see a market for that vaccine. No one knew how many doses would be needed, where they would be needed, and when, and therefore there was no interest in the vaccine. However, when Ebola finally hit West Africa, Canada made some doses of the vaccine, donated them to WHO, and an agreement was also signed with a large multinational manufacturer to start making the vaccines. Now, in addition to there being vaccines available, there were other tools such as antibodies. But for the global community to coordinate and get these tools to places where the outbreak was affecting people was a challenge. WHO held consultations and decided that it would be important to use a vaccine in this context. And a decision had to be made on the study design, which vaccine would be used, where these studies would be done. And this took nearly 10 months. By the time a ring vaccination strategy, where in Ebola, you usually acquire the disease through contact with individuals who are already infected. And the idea of a ring vaccination strategy was to make sure that no one was denied access to a vaccine. So the rings were divided between people who would receive, the contacts of cases who would receive the vaccine immediately after the contact, and groups that would receive the vaccine 21 days later. So overall, when the vaccination was initiated, they were able to identify 90 cases and created then 90 rings around them. But as you can see here, vaccination was initiated towards the tail end of the epidemic. Nonetheless, in Guinea, 90 rings were vaccinated. And within about 4 months after the vaccine trial had started, a clear answer was available. Immediate vaccination protected, delayed vaccination, there were cases that were seen. So this was an incredibly effective vaccine that had been around for over 10 years before it was finally used in an epidemic. This vaccine has been now licensed and is available for use, but it took 20 years from start to finish to get this vaccine made, tested, and licensed. So in response to what was happening with Ebola, there were many discussions around how the world needed to change, what else needed to be done to make sure that vaccines reached people quickly. The Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, which was a grouping that was formed by the government of Norway in partnership with the World Economic Forum and the Wellcome Trust and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Department of Biotechnology in India, was established in Norway with the idea that vaccines should be made against diseases that are predicted to have the potential to cause outbreaks. And these vaccines could be developed, could be kept in readiness so that when there was an outbreak, the vaccines could be utilized quickly. And that this should be done without worrying about how much the vaccines would cost the people who needed to use the vaccines. So it really was a philanthropic effort to foster the science for protection against emerging infectious diseases. Now, when CEPI was established, it was decided it would align very closely with the WHO R&D blueprint, which presents every year the top 10 threats to global health. And 3 targets were chosen from the R&D blueprint, which were Lassa, MERS coronavirus, and Nipah. Now, the R&D blueprint always has one additional 11th target, which is disease X, the disease that we don't know where it will come from, when, how many people it'll affect, and what it'll be caused by. In addition to Lassa, MERS, and Nipah, when more funding became available, Rift Valley fever and chikungunya were added as targets. The goal was to advance vaccines through phase 2A of testing and keep those vaccines ready in case there was an outbreak due to that pathogen. So CEPI had programs going that were funded in 2018 and 2019 for MERS coronavirus and for Disease X or platform technologies. Because CEPI had these ongoing programs, about 2 weeks after the sequence for SARS-CoV-2 became available, the first 3 vaccine candidates from CEPI's existing programs were asked to shift their focus to SARS-CoV-2, and they did. Now, why was it possible for us to shift focus so quickly to developing vaccines for SARS-CoV-2? It was because we already knew many things about coronaviruses. In 2003, we had dealt with SARS-CoV-1, as it's now called. This affected about 8,000 people. About 10% of people who were infected died, and a large proportion of healthcare workers were affected. Now, in SARS-CoV-2, we found that people became infectious after they manifested with symptoms, and good infection control practices could limit spread. It then became possible through really good nursing and medical care to ensure that patients were isolated, and with time, the outbreak died down and has never recurred. But at this time, efforts began to develop a vaccine for SARS. In addition to that, in 2012, we had MERS coronavirus, and this was a respiratory illness that was first reported in Saudi Arabia and then spread to many other countries. Now, MERS is also a zoonotic infection. It comes very frequently from people who have contact with camels, and it's believed to have entered camels through bats. Now, MERS has only affected less than 3,000 people in the world, but it has a much higher case fatality rate, with 1/3 of people who develop MERS dying. Now, MERS continues to happen because there is continued transmission from camels to humans. Now, because we knew about other coronaviruses, it was very easy when SARS-CoV-2 came along to identify that we really needed to focus our efforts in vaccine development on the spike protein, and in the spike protein on the receptor binding domain, because the receptor binding domain is what interacts with the human host receptor, which is the ACE2 protein. So shown in this ribbon diagram at the bottom is SARS-CoV in blue and SARS-CoV-2 in magenta, with ACE2 in green. As you can see here, because we knew a lot about the structure of SARS-CoV, we could predict what was likely to happen with SARS-CoV-2 and its binding to the ACE receptor. Using these lessons, it was possible to quickly move into vaccine development. And we are now in a situation where we have over 300 vaccine candidates. Never have so many vaccine development efforts been undertaken for a single pathogen. So we have over 200 candidates that are in preclinical studies, in laboratories, in animal testing. We currently have 38 candidates that are in human phase 1 studies, looking at safety and dosage. We have 24 that are in phase 2, looking at expanded safety and immunogenicity, and 20 candidates that are in clinical phase 3 efficacy studies that require tens of thousands of participants. We have 8 vaccines that are licensed for limited use and 3 that are licensed for full use. We also have 3 candidates that went into human testing and have been abandoned for a range of reasons. Now, there are two basic types of platforms, though we'll hear many names about SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. Traditionally, vaccines have either been developed to deliver an entire particle or an entire organism or part of an organism. The proteins are given to people, and these induce an immune response. For bacteria, you can also have polysaccharide vaccines, but for viruses, it's proteins. Now we have a new set of vaccines that have been developed or are in development. And these are vaccines that rely not on delivering the protein, but on delivering the message for the protein. And shown in red here are either the spike protein or the message for the spike protein. At the bottom, in vectored vaccines, we use a virus to carry the message for the spike protein into host cells. In DNA vaccines, we integrate the message for the spike protein into plasmid DNA. And in RNA vaccines, we deliver messenger RNA wrapped in a lipid nanoparticle or a fatty particle so that the message gets inside cells, and then the cells produce the spike protein against which the host makes an immune response. I won't walk through all of the candidates. I will just highlight a couple. Moderna and Pfizer BioNTech gave us their results in November of 2020, showing us that these vaccines have efficacy in protecting against disease that is over 90%. There are many other such vaccines that are in development. We also have viral vectored vaccines. The most known names at this time are AstraZeneca or the University of Oxford that uses a chimpanzee adenovirus, which has over 70% efficacy. The Gamaleya Institute, which uses two different adenoviruses and has shown over 90% efficacy. CanSino, a Chinese company that's using another adenovirus vector, and J&J, which is using yet another adenovirus vector that it has also used for its Ebola vaccines. Two viral vectored vaccines that were with Merck have currently been abandoned. Now we have vaccines that have worked, but we also have a lot of other things that we need to think about. With 200 candidates in development, how many clinical efficacy trials can we do? If we need tens of thousands of participants, where should these trials be done? The Chinese vaccines, after China was able to control the pandemic, they had to be tested in South America, in Africa, and the Middle East. We don't yet know about the long-term safety of the vaccines, though in general, these vaccines appear to be very safe. It's very difficult to do head-to-head comparisons of these vaccines because the model systems and the assays that have been done have been very different. We are hearing about problems of manufacturing and supply. And it's actually a good thing that we are hearing about this because 1 year after the pandemic started, if we are in a situation where we are worrying about how many places are going to get how many doses and when, that's a good problem to have because we know that vaccines are coming. And I hope that these issues will be sorted out soon so that everyone in the world will have access and delivery can be accelerated. There have been issues of vaccine nationalism with rich countries booking doses of vaccines that are enough for many times more than their populations. They're placing bets on which ones will succeed. And more recently, we've had this problem that we are all hearing about, which is the variant strains. Now, one thing that has been happening that has been really unusual in this pandemic is the sharing of data. A repository that was set up for gathering influenza data has been collecting data on SARS-CoV-2, and that's heading to 400,000 genomes. It has tools that allow you to do classifications, and other groups have developed additional tools for analysis and for tracking of strains. In the past couple of months, we've had a lot of new variants that have emerged. They're called by various names. They have arisen in various parts of the world, 3 different continents and probably more. But there are really 5 things that we need to worry about with the variants. Will our tests work so that we can detect them? Do they spread faster? And it seems that they do. Do they cause more severe disease? And this is something we are still trying to figure out. And if we had treatments that were directed against them, do the mutations mean that the treatments won't work? And will our prevention strategy, which is vaccines, also not work? These are all areas of very intense, very active study. But I think one of the things that is important to emphasize is that in 2009, when we had H1N1, the world decided vaccines would be a good strategy. But by the time vaccines became available, treatments became available, WHO, which was to provide them to the world, received such little supply and so late that it wasn't worth using anymore. This time, WHO and partners have been really, really active, and in April established the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, where the idea was to have vaccines, diagnostics, and treatments that could be made available for low and middle income countries, as well as rich countries, in a more equitable fashion. For the vaccines pillar, CEPI has been focusing on development and manufacturing, the World Health Organization on policy and on allocation, and Gavi on procurement and delivery through the COVAX facility. The idea of the COVAX facility is to have both rich and low and middle income countries participate, so that there is a larger ability to negotiate good prices for everyone. And the idea is that low and middle income countries that are considered Gavi eligible, and that's 92 countries, will be provided sufficient vaccine for 20% of their population by the end of 2021. This is very different from anything that we've been able to do in the past. We need vaccines, we need them developed, we need them used, and we need them fast. What has happened in the past year is that we've compressed 10 years of vaccinology into 10 months and shown that we can make vaccines incredibly fast. We've collaborated to promise vaccines to at least 20% of the world, and we will start delivering that soon. Those are the good things. There are some not so great things. Lack of vaccine confidence was anticipated, but is not being dealt with as well as we might have hoped. And we still have to deal with inequity and uncertain timelines. But we have learned a great deal about the need for resilience, and we've done much better than we did in 2009 and during the Ebola outbreak. So future pandemics will come. Our world is changing, and this is inevitable, but we will be better prepared, we will be better coordinated, and we will make sure that the next time around, we do a better job than we've done this time. Thank you for your attention.
an absolute delight to be speaking here today at the conference. It's really something that I'm so passionate about, looking at how we have to bring about a change in the way we look at our world. And of course, we all realize what an impact COVID has had on all of us, no matter where we live on this planet. So our ability to actually think about how we become a lot more resilient, how we think about society, how we think about our needs on this planet, whether we're thinking about, products that we need in our health systems, whether we're talking about the everyday home items, industries, all of these different types of, everyday part of lives rely very much on our ability to actually make products. And these products, of course, are directly as a result of meeting the needs of our society. So the important question, of course, is how do we make sure that our society is resilient well and truly into the future is by one, recognizing that materials that make the products are not infinite. We have to indeed think about long-term sustainability, think about resilience, and so therefore bringing together the worlds of making materials, making products, recycling end-of-life products are important. And in the way we bring it all together means that we need to start to think about circular economy. And it is so important that as scientists, we are not just thinking about problems, but we're also thinking about solutions and how solutions can actually be deployed in the hands of end users so that we can genuinely make a real difference to the lives of people, whether they are health workers or whether they are people working in our factories, and just indeed people who go about their everyday lives. How are we going to become a resilient society? This is where, of course, circular economy can play such an important role. And here at UNSW in Sydney, we've actually developed a whole new way of thinking about recycling and manufacturing is by aligning recycling and manufacturing together. And indeed, by showing that our factories can actually be designed and developed to be micro factories is where we are shaping a whole new way of thinking that not everything has to be all about economies of scale, but indeed we can start to think about economies of purpose. And what I mean by that is really how we can indeed show that our materials, our products can indeed be recycled at a local level. Our micro factories that we run, our demonstration facilities at UNSW have clearly shown that it is absolutely possible to take end-of-life waste products and put them back into remanufacturing. And once we do that, we can actually showcase that there are absolutely no limits in the number of times we can actually use our materials for recycling, for remanufacturing. But it's very important then that the world of science works closely with end users, whether our end users are our factories, our hospitals. It is so important that we all see ourselves as part of circular solutions. And when we can think about this type of laterally integrated systems where we're all part of this whole circular economy, then we can actually start to see how we might be able to think about solutions in a holistic manner. So imagine if we can take our waste plastics that come out of our hospitals as part of our personal protective equipment or PPE, and imagine if we could put that back into manufacturing and remanufacturing and creating new products over and over again. And indeed, this is where circular economy solutions that we've been developing here at the Smart Centre at UNSW in Sydney has actually shown that it is indeed possible to bring together researchers, end users, industries to indeed work together. And there are small companies who are collecting waste materials and indeed utilizing that in manufacturing. So the alignment of recycling and manufacturing, and to do that in a way that it is distributed so that ultimately we can decide on what is the right scale. And that right scale, that's got to be fit for purpose, so that we are manufacturing products and we can be responsive to the needs of society. So that's really where resilience comes in. And to give you some of the examples of what we have shown successfully, we've already shown that it is possible to take waste tires, for instance, and replace some of the coal that is used in the process of making steel. And that ability to now start to replace coal by using waste rubber tires is where what we call the first generation of our green steel solution that's been developed here and indeed commercialized in Australia. We are looking at, of course, ultimately complete elimination of coal and coke from electric arc furnace steelmaking. So that's an example of how not only are we reducing our carbon footprint, but at the same time, in manufacturing steel products, we're using products like our end-of-life tires. And of course, when you start to look at materials that come out of our transport sector, cars and all kinds of other vehicles, we know that metals like steel will typically get recycled. But of course, when it comes to a whole lot of plastics and tires, and now, of course, we're talking about batteries, how do we address that all-important question of recycling some of these more complex materials? Because it's more than just thinking about recycling. It's important to think about it as a valuable resource. And in doing so, we have to recognize that there are a range of different types of materials, different types of plastics, and indeed really valuable materials and metals that we can access in indeed our vehicles. So these are examples of how our smart technologies are indeed showcasing our ability to transform our waste into valuable materials and products. And indeed, our green steel technology, which has not only recycled millions and millions of tires and kept these tires out of landfills and used them in steel making, in electric arc furnace steel making, but also equally importantly, it has shown that we can reduce carbon footprint of these types of technologies by actually harnessing hydrogen that is indeed present in our rubber tires. So it's quite interesting to think about waste now no longer as a waste, but rather very much as a green resource, as a material that indeed allows us to manufacture more green materials, and in this case, green steel. And of course, there are many other examples of high quality metals. And another important solution is around recognizing that electronic waste, once again, a lot of e-waste coming out of our cars, lots of high quality copper and battery materials. But there's also high quality materials that are present, for example, in electronic devices that are present in our everyday things that we don't even think about. A lot of our appliances in our homes, a lot of expensive devices that are present in our hospitals. So imagine if we could indeed utilize all those end-of-life electronic waste materials and manufacture and remanufacture all kinds of components and devices. So we are now taking into our own hands our ability to manufacture locally produced products that are required for local applications. And this brings us right back to that point I was making earlier around economies of purpose. And in this case, imagine if you were in a situation where you needed an important device, you needed to fix a particular product in your hospital. How do you actually go about doing that? We have shown that indeed it is possible to take waste plastics from our electronic sources and produce 3D printed products that are made out of 100% recycled high quality plastics. So indeed, as we have shown in so many different research scenarios, that it is absolutely possible to imagine a future where 100% recycled, not only metals, but plastics as well can be utilized in various applications. But to enable us to do that, what we have shown is at our microfactories that we have demonstration facilities at UNSW in Sydney, are indeed being deployed to take waste plastics from a range of different types of end-of-life products. Take, for example, all the plastics that's there in our electronic systems, our everyday printers in our homes, in our offices. All of this is high-quality plastics, and that we have shown that it is indeed possible to transform them into valuable materials like indeed filaments that can then go into manufacturing and using 3D printers for manufacturing high quality products. So again, I wanted to convey the message that it is, as we think about building resilience, as we think about how do we take a whole lot of plastics coming out of our homes, out of our lives, our hospitals, and put them back into remanufacturing. This is where, of course, microfactories have shown that it is indeed feasible to achieve these types of goals. Smart Center at UNSW has shown that it is important to have that foundation of scientific research to really go beyond just thinking about the research in our labs, but indeed show how it is possible to translate that knowledge and that learning into practice, and defining best practices and being very agile and flexible in the way we adopt solutions is going to be very important if we're going to build resilience. It's going to be important that we encourage businesses, big and small, to have a complete shift in mindset. And that shift in mindset is going to come from the fact that science is going to demonstrate that it is possible to actually make high quality materials and high quality products out of our waste resources. So we should no longer be looking at as waste as something bad or something negative, but rather looking at waste as a valuable material, and it is simply waiting to be harnessed and to be transformed into high quality products. And to enable us to do that, the science that we've developed here at UNSW is called the science of micro-recycling. And why we're talking about micro-recycling is we're getting right down at the molecular level, and we're using those molecules that are present in our waste resources. So, for example, we're able to liberate hydrogen molecules out of waste tires in the process of making steel, and we do that in situ, right inside the electric arc furnace. That then allows a steelmaker to indeed reduce its dependency on coal and bring into that supply chain very much that ability to actually utilize waste tires. So their supplier now becomes someone who's collecting waste tires. So you can imagine that it's a win-win outcome both for our environment as well as for our economy. And this is where, of course, what we introduce is the concept of going beyond the 3 R's of reduce, reuse, recycle, and talk about a 4th R that we call reform. And what we mean by that is we have to reimagine, we have to innovate in our approach towards how we think about waste. And when we start to do that, we're not only thinking about conversion of like to like, that is not just converting glass into glass and plastics into plastics, but rather thinking about a diversity and a whole range of different types of products and opportunities, so that our materials and our waste products can be transformed and have many, many lives over and over again. And we can actually think about manufacturing where indeed the main input feedstock can be harnessed from waste resources. To enable us to do that, of course, what we have to be confident is that it's not just us as researchers working on the science, but we are part of a driving force that drives that shift in mindset. And I think, to me, when we actually achieve that ability to collaborate and work together with end users, with industries, with practitioners, and when we can inspire everyone around us to adopt some of these new practices, these new circular economy solutions, I think this is where, of course, we can build resilience in our society and show that it indeed our ability to think about remanufacturing, think about how smart technologies and microfactories and these types of solutions can then be deployed globally, no matter where you are in the world. the basic needs that humans have, whether it's around our health needs and the need to access clean water, need to access a clean environment around us. All of these are important questions. How do we deliver that? How do we make that happen? We have to indeed drive change where we start to think about accessibility and affordability of technological solutions so that it is indeed something that everyone can benefit from. Our ability to actually show these micro factories at UNSW is now showing that we are not only running these demonstration facilities within a university setting, but indeed in our regional towns. In fact, one of our first micro factories that we're looking to commercialize is not too far from Sydney, here in a regional town called Cootamundra. And indeed, from our perspective, the ability to actually showcase that we can recycle waste glass and waste textile and create products for our building applications is something that we are demonstrating at Cootamundra. So the ability to align manufacturing and circular economy can be done on various scales. It's not always about bigger is better, but it's about the scale and the production that is fit for purpose, that is right for purpose. And indeed, some of the work we are doing in showcasing how taking waste plastics can be transformed into products. And by doing 100% recycled waste plastics, we can actually demonstrate that we can in the future have a far more sustainable way of thinking about our materials and our products. So indeed, when we're also talking about all of the other materials like our waste textiles and our waste glass, so many different types of materials that indeed are coming out of our economy, we are indeed looking at the opportunity here to take, for example, our waste glass and textiles and convert those into products for our building applications. So indeed, we've created green ceramics. These green ceramics have actually been deployed here by a company that is in fact building apartments. And imagine in the future where the interior ceramic products are indeed made out of predominantly recycled glass and textiles. So our green ceramic is quite a unique combination of two very unlikely candidates of glass and textiles that, of course, gives it the right properties, makes it an engineered product that is fit for purpose. So our ability to actually transform these different types of waste materials and bring them to life into so many different ways is really where our waste to products through microfactories are being demonstrated, whether they are for our plastics, our glass, our textile. It is actually a whole new mindset. And indeed, we know how urgent it has become for us to indeed address some of the challenges imposed upon our societies, whether these are climate challenges, whether they are COVID challenges. We know it is very important to think about how we're going to meet the needs of our societies across the world. How are we going to produce, for example, affordable housing? How are we going to, manufacture affordable and more sustainable materials and products like our PPE that we so desperately need in our hospitals? What is that new normal going to look like? Now that we are in 2021, we have to start thinking about all of these challenges that we have faced in 2020 in a far more positive and a proactive manner. So as scientists, we do need to, in fact, be a lot more proactive and positive and drive change and be one of the forces that brings about a shift in mindset. So what it means is we've got to indeed bring about that thinking both with our heads and our hearts, and hopefully both our heads and our heart can indeed play a part in how we shape our future, which is what this conference hopefully will shine a light on. So many fabulous ideas and conversations. So it is beginning of a whole new proactive way of thinking about what a resilient future should look like. Thank you so much for having me.
Former President Tong, it's such a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak with you on such important issues. Could I ask you first of all about the COP26 summit that's coming up in the UK? In your view, what are the most important outcomes required from this meeting to help countries such as Kiribati, which are at such high risk from sea level rise as a result of climate change?
Well, let me begin, as we always do, with a greeting. So it's a traditional way of interacting. And so what we do is we say, come to meeting, may you be blessed, okay? And so let me do that. And
thank you. But
you know, the question is something that I've always been confronted with over the years of my advocacy work. And it's the question is, what can be done that would be meaningful for those countries on the front line, like Kiribati, Tuvalu in the Pacific and the Marshall Islands. And over the years, I've been attending conference after conference. And I've read the reports of the IPCC definitely indicate that whatever happens, the countries on the front line, especially the low-lying island countries, have a real issue. One of the most difficult challenges, it's about the survival is at stake. And so I've always, every time I go to a conference, I always ask the question, what can I take back to my people? That I can hand back to them to say, don't you worry about what is coming. This is the solution. And so, frankly, that question has never been answered until today. Because according to the projections of the IPCC, regardless of what happens, whether we achieve zero level emissions as a global community, countries on the front line like Kiribati will continue to go underwater with the rising sea level. And so that is the biggest challenge. We're at the very bottom of the spectrum of the challenge. And for me, I've come to acknowledge that reality. But I think the question is, what else can we do? And so I think if the question that you raised is about what can happen in COP26 that would be meaningful for countries like mine, okay, what options can be provided to ensure that they can either remain in their home islands or that they can survive into the future, okay? And so that is the biggest challenge. And I think it's one of the most difficult questions that has never been addressed in all of the time that I've been addressing this issue. And until today, I'm not sure that it can be answered. And hopefully at COP26, some semblance of a response can be provided. Because otherwise, all we do is we ask for mitigation, we ask for reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but it won't do us any good, but it will do the rest. Maybe there would be some sense of redemption for the rest. But the question is, what happens to the countries like mine, as you asked the question? And I think over the years, I've been confronted with ideas about how can we build the adaptation in order to survive the decades ahead. And unfortunately, I think that's never been answered. And so in all the time that I've been addressing this issue, do we have to come to the situation where we have to relocate? But quite frankly, that question has never been answered until today as well. So hopefully the COP26 will address these very hard questions, because if we do not survive, it's going to be very difficult for the rest of the global community to survive.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you. So you have founded the Phoenix Island Protected Area, that's one of the world's largest marine conservation areas, recognized by the UN as an exemplary model of international cooperation in marine protection. So turning to the question of the oceans now, the key lessons that you learned from this initiative, and how might these lessons be drawn on for the protection of marine life and resources elsewhere?
Okay, let me explain a bit of the background why I did something crazy like that. Because it was in my desperation to be heard at the international level, because we're a small country. I think we got to accept that, and I acknowledge that. And nobody would listen to us. That is the reality of the international processes. And so it's about the challenge that we are facing. And I have, in all of my advocacy, I've been demanding for sacrifices to be made. I've been demanding that we can never tackle the challenge of climate change until we can make the sacrifices, until we can make the commitments. So I was demanding this of the international community. And I thought that, we must also step forward with our own sacrifice. And so that was our sacrifice. That was our contribution to the future of humanity. And but I think in the process of doing that, a number of issues came to the forefront. One was that for the first time, we'd always regarded ourselves as small island states. But realizing the extent of our marine exclusive marine exclusive economic zone, we are actually a large ocean states, and so we can make that sacrifice. And so it was a very difficult political decision. I can assure you, because people could not, my own people could not understand why we would go ahead and do this when we needed the revenue from the fishing license. And for me, it was also a challenge to the international community, because we're demanding this of the larger developed countries, and we are doing it. We can do it. So why cannot the rest? Okay, and so it's a combination of many issues. But let me say that in doing so, I think we realized that not only can we do it, but we also realized that we needed to do it because it was necessary for the conservation of the resource. We depend very, very largely on our fisheries. And we had to put some conservation measures in place, because we began to realize that as what happened to the North Atlantic fishery, it was destroyed. And it was beginning to happen in the Pacific fishery. And so we had to take some drastic measures. My background is fisheries, it's fisheries economics. And so I understood that. And so we had to step forward, because it's not easy to convince not my own people, but more importantly, the larger Pacific region. And so we did that. And I think in the process, other countries began to realize that it was necessary, that it can be done. And that as a region, we are the only ones with the oceans that can do it. And I think one of the things that we also learned is that we can be quite influential at the global stage, especially on issues which are very, very critical to us. And so certainly the ocean area is something that I think we have. All of the countries in the Pacific region have the highest proportion of ocean to land mass. And so I think in a sense, we owe that as custodians of this huge resource.
So this is in a sense really leading by example here, in the hope that other nations will follow.
Let me be quite frank. When we did this, we did not quite realize the implications of what it means to the rest. And I can remember my colleagues in the Pacific Islands saying, we're doing this because you did it. And but it was an ambitious, in a sense, we were stepping into a new area, and we didn't quite know where we were heading, but we thought we needed to do it because of what was happening on the climate challenge stage. And we had to alert the world that we need to do something. But I think something we also learned is, we cannot continue to stand by while all of this is happening. We've got to step in. We've got to make our presence and our voices to be heard.
So I guess this is an example of an initiative you took that was really successful. And I wonder what, in your opinion, are perhaps your greatest successes in the campaigns that you've had for action and awareness on climate change and the oceans. What lessons do you think you could pass on for future generations of scientists and policymakers?
Well, certainly something we learned is, you know, we are a former colony. And I think many of the countries in the Pacific region are former colonies. And in that respect, we've always really had somewhat of an inferior complex of ourselves, our ability to interact on the international stage. Sometimes we feel quite inconsequential and quite often irrelevant. We just observers. And I think there was a time when it came to me that this is an issue we cannot stand by. And as I was reading the IPCC reports coming forward, and I was listening to the debates at the United Nations General Assembly, it didn't make sense to me, because what can I say at the United Nations General Assembly that meant something to me? Everybody was talking about terrorism. We are always talking about the usual developmental challenges, the North-South confrontation, but it didn't sound genuine to me. But as I was reading the IPCC reports, I said, this is important. It's about our future survival, and nobody is seeing this. And that's when I started getting onto pushing it, and then not only as I delved more into it, it became more real that this is an area that was so critical and important, initially for our own survival. And for a long time, I could not understand why other countries, other people could not see what I was seeing. Okay, and I think what I felt was important was the ability to be able to say something and to be heard. Okay, and I remember my first presentation when I spoke in 2008 at the World Environment Day in New Zealand, and I remember the Prime Minister of New Zealand then saying, "No, you speak." And here we are. I was speaking with the chair of the IPCC, Dr. Pachauri, bless him, he's passed away, and Kim Steiner. These are people who are on the front line of the issue. And I said, what can I say? Just tell your story. And my story has always been about the human dimension of climate change. Climate change is not about science. It's not simply about conservation. It's not simply about the environment. It's always been about people. And I remember one occasion when I spoke at the UN, and I said, yes, I've read this report about from the National Geographic about what is happening with the habitat of the polar bears. But I've never read anything about the habitat of people like me in the center of the Pacific being threatened. And I think that was a bit sobering, because it brought home to the reality that here were people concerned about animals, but not focusing a lot of attention on people at the other end, at the other side of the world. And I think it's about maybe refocusing the international attention on the realities of what climate change meant for people. Climate change is about people, the challenge to people.
Thank you. So if I could turn to the role of the Commonwealth, this being the Commonwealth Science Conference, of the 54 member states of the Commonwealth, 24 are small island developing states like Kiribati.
Right.
So I'd like to ask you, what role do you think the Commonwealth can play as a group of nations to make coordinated action on these shared challenges that affect states like yours, the small island nations?
Well, the Commonwealth is in fact a very unique organization, because it's in reality a mini United Nations, because it draws its membership from all continents of the world, different regions, different ethnic groupings. And so we're the most diverse, apart from the United Nations, we're the next most diverse membership. And so in that respect, we are, in a sense, a mini United Nations. You know, it's, I've been at this Commonwealth Heads of Governments meetings, and it's so interesting interacting with people from different cultures. And I find it extremely enriching. But I think what was more important is we have a great deal more in common than we do realize. At the end of the day, we're simply human beings. Whether we are leaders with a long train of motorcade in support, once we are on our own, we are just individuals, people with the same vulnerabilities, with the same concerns. And I think quite often we need to be able to do that, to interact as people like that. And in that sense, during the Commonwealth Heads of Government, one of the things that happens is the retreat of leaders, when leaders alone interact with each other. And I think this is something that is missing in the United Nations. At the United Nations General Assembly, we just come and deliver a statement and go away. There's got to be more interaction. And I think the United Nations can learn from what the Commonwealth is doing in that respect. Because at the end of the day, the personal connections that are established between leaders is actually extremely vital. And it can make a difference between resolving issues or not resolving issues. And so I think the Commonwealth can in a sense, that pass that kind of forum to the United Nations. I tried to do it. I tried to do that before the Copenhagen meeting. I was in a closed meeting with maybe 26 heads in New York before the Copenhagen meeting. And I spoke to the chair, the Prime Minister of Denmark. I said, why don't you call a retreat of leaders? Because then we speak as people, not politicians, not people with our own national agenda. Because that's been always the problem in addressing the issue of climate change. And so I think in that sense, the Commonwealth can make that contribution. I think on another level, the Commonwealth, the membership of the Commonwealth is drawn from mostly the developing countries, in addition to the fact that most of them are small island developing states. And they've been very influential in many ways. I think I can say with absolute certainty that what happened with the SDG agenda on climate change, and especially the ocean, was actually determined by mostly the Commonwealth, small island developing states. What happened in Paris in 2015, I think to a large extent was influenced by the outcome of the agreement which happened in Malta before the Paris meeting. So yes, I think the Commonwealth has made a contribution and can continue to make that contribution to international understanding and also international affairs.
Thank you very much. So could I turn now to the global scientific community? As we're here as a gathering of scientists, there has been, of course, a great deal of research already, but what more can the global scientific community do to help contribute to this fight against climate change? Is it a question of where more research is needed? And how do you balance that against the need for advice and advocacy? How do these fit together?
No, I think the scientific community have always done a wonderful job, okay? I think the scientific community is not at fault because they focus on the science. It is the policymakers who have not taken heed of the science. And I think that's been the problem. But what the scientific community can do is continue to focus on developing and actually advocating for renewable energy as a credible source of energy. And because I think they gave up too easily against the onslaught by the corporations, which had much to lose if renewable energy was in place. Okay, and I've been following a lot of what's been happening in terms of the strength of the lobby of the fossil fuel industry. And I think our scientific community needs to be able to withstand that pressure. Okay, and keep stepping forward, and not be intimidated by things like the I saw the merchants of doubt. Okay, people who chose to invalidate the science. In 2018 I came across the same thing when the IPCC came forward with the report, and then it was denied, invalidated by not by the scientists, but by politicians who had an agenda with the fossil fuel industry. So they got to be more courageous, is to say, we are right, you are wrong. Okay, don't be intimidated. And I think this is something that should have been done. If it had been done, and we would be further ahead today than we are now. Okay, but it took a long time for the scientific controversy to be resolved. But at the end of the day, it came out that the fossil fuel industry always knew about this, but they kept it hidden. And so hopefully we can get away from this, but I think I believe it's never been the problem. The scientific community has never been the problem. It's the policymakers who deliberately choose not to take the science. And I think we have lots of examples of that. I think the science is very sound. It's our political leadership who, in some way or other, they become compromised and cannot make the right decisions. And they begin to, I've been asked questions about what happened with COVID-19. Why could not, as compared to the challenge of climate change? And my response has been this, because with COVID-19, everybody's agreed this is a danger to life, everybody's life. But with climate change, it's a danger to some people's lives, but it's a wonderful source of wealth for some people. And so that has always been the problem. Hopefully, we can have a conversation where we're not talking about our short-term political agenda for the next until the next election, but we can, instead of having a short-term political vision, perhaps we can have a more global leadership with the vision to look beyond the next election and into the next generation, rather than these short-term visions. I've had personal experience of interacting with the changes in government in Australia, in your country. I think you know what I do in your country, where every time there's a change of government, there is a change of policy on climate change. Mm-hmm. Also in New Zealand, I've had that confrontation with your own leaders. In the United States, we have this prime example of where with the previous administration, it was so anti. When President Obama was there, we had a wonderful change. Now we're back to where we were with President Obama. And so nature does not care what political party is in government. It will continue to react to what we do to her. And so hopefully I really hope that we can realize this and not begin to believe that we can do these things and get away with it without any cost. So simply in my summary, I would say that the science has been sound. It's the policymakers with their short-term agenda that has been the problem.
Thank you. And for my final question, I'd like to ask what your message would be to the early career researchers who will be participating in this conference. So how can this young generation of scientists help to ensure the best use of their research to address these global challenges, both in climate change and in ocean conservation? Do you have a message for this group?
Yes, indeed, I do. And I think, as I said, the science has been sound, okay? And if anything, the researchers have to find a new way of structuring how we do things at the political level. Because I'm beginning to think that I've always, and I said this in a number of statements that I've made, that the pure science, but I think we need to talk about the political science, okay? And because we are not, as leaders, as political leaders, we're not we're not using the science that's coming forward, the information. And I don't know how else, one of the things that I've always had difficulty with is that I've been asked on many occasions, how can we make this messaging much more effective? And I think the answer to that is, it's not easy, because that's something that I've been trying to do for almost 2 decades now. But I think what is very important is how to provide the kind of information, because I think we need to educate the public in order that they can influence the politics. I was asked once when I gave a talk at Sydney University, I think, and they asked me, "Oh, how can we influence our politicians?" I said, "No, I'm not here to confront your politicians. You elected your politicians. And if you think they're not doing it right, unelect them." And I think, but I can see that there is a change. And I think the scientists have done their work. But I think what is important is the young people are taking this, because you and I, we're at the age when even the environment was not such an issue when we were at school, when climate change was never an issue, when the issue of the reality of limited resources in this planet was not a real issue. But now it is. We've come to realize with all the technology that we have to know what we can and cannot do, or what we should and should not do with what is there. It's a different, we are coming into a different generation. And what so excites me is the young people taking to the streets and telling people like you and me, telling leaders. And I was talking to to the young people in Australia the other evening, and I said, if you have a problem, at school, go and get the children of the CEOs of the corporations that are doing this, and tell them that what their parents and their companies are doing is destroying their future. And I think this is where we must head. And I think in terms of what the science can do, the science keeps doing what it's doing. Being honest, and don't remain undaunted by the power of the denial. I think that's been the problem that we've confronted. I've been following quite a lot of what's been going on, and I remember the discussion that I had. I listened to when one of when the audience challenged Dr. Pachauri about the science. He said no, and he was very courageous, and he said no, this is rubbish. And so our young scientists must do this. They must have the confidence in their science, and they must push it. And don't be intimidated, because it only lends credibility to our own political leaders who may have a side agenda. And so it's time to be very frank. There is no time to pretend that the things that are happening are not happening. This is something that I spent quite a good part of my life following and trying to understand. And I think it's, in a sense, I find there is a class division here. The people who benefit by the fossil fuel industry, the people who believe that whatever happens on climate change, they will have the capacity to remain above it, regardless of what happens to the rest. And I think this is the greatest strategy. The empathy, the humanity about it, it's all being pushed aside. And I think we need to be more human. We need to be more, we need to have more compassion. And I think this is what I believe in our part of the world we can share the way we, in our culture and the way we live our life, we virtually share everything. And I think maybe we've gone too far overboard in trying in the capitalist credo of greed is great. I don't think we need to continue to do that. That is no longer sustainable, because this planet cannot keep sustaining that.
Yeah, so thank you very much. And I think what I take from this is that the young scientists attending this conference should stay strong and they should work together to meet these great challenges of our time.
I want to thank the scientists. I've been asked on a number of occasions, and I say, the scientists, they are our prophets of today, because they tell us, in the olden days, there were the prophets who were touched by, they've been touched by the divine. But the scientists today are our prophets of today. And in their own way, they've been touched by the divine because they have that capacity. And they have that duty and responsibility to report it to us, to give us the message which they've been given in some way. So I want to convey my deep gratitude for the science, but I think also we need to apologize if we haven't listened to their prophetic predictions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Stanley. It's wonderful, and
it's a great pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for these inspiring words.
Well, it's as you know, it's a bit of a passion for me, and I've always enjoyed interacting on an issue like this because it is not a scientific curiosity. It is a matter of survival for people like mine. But thank you so much for this evening, and all the best to you and to our audience this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to do this presentation. What I hope to do in the next 20 minutes is to share with you a tale of two pandemics, the pandemics of AIDS and COVID-19. I'll start by talking about the dual pandemics, and I'll give you just a snapshot picture before talking a little bit more in depth about COVID-19 in South Africa, then deal with the two epidemics as they collide with each other in Africa, before capturing what I consider to be 5 key lessons from the HIV epidemic that inform the COVID-19 response and make some concluding remarks. So let's look at the two pandemics at a glance. When we look at the HIV situation, we're looking at 38 million people living with HIV and about 1.7 million infections in the last year. About 700,000 people have died from HIV last year. Compare that to the COVID-19 pandemic, where there were 98 million cases. In fact, now just topping 100 million cases. We've had over 2 million deaths from COVID-19. Certainly, as we look at these two pandemics against each other in the short time frame of a year, we get some idea of how severe and substantial the COVID-19 pandemic is compared to HIV. Let's now look at the COVID-19 situation in South Africa. When we had our first case back on the 4th of March, we ended up with a situation where for the first 3 weeks, the epidemic in South Africa was growing at a rapid rate. We were doubling every 2 days, more or less on par with the rate at which the epidemic was growing in the UK. However, very early and decisive action, even before we had our first death, led to a situation where the epidemic slowed very substantially to a doubling time of 15 days. And so we were able to postpone the initial peak. Instead of it occurring in April, we eventually had our peak in July. But after the peak settled and we were at a trough level, we did not anticipate two very important features which led to our second wave. The first was that at the end of October, as the students started finishing their examinations, both at university and high school level, that the parties would start. And in the midst of all of that, there comes around a new variant. The variant we've referred to as 501Y V2 variant. The combination of those two led to the virus being seeded everywhere in our country and a rapid rise in new cases, putting enormous pressure on the hospital system. And as we proceed now, on the downturn of the second wave, we are now slowly heading into a situation of a trough. And hopefully, as vaccines are rolled out, we will hope that we may see a slightly lesser burden in the third wave. What has been the feature of this second wave has been the rapid rate at which infections have occurred. This was described in a study which was undertaken here at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, where the variant showed 23 different mutations, 20 of which were associated with amino acid changes, and how this variant very quickly became dominant. From one that didn't exist, within a matter of 6 weeks became the variant that accounted for about 90% of all new infections. And so that's what we began to see. If we look here at the epidemics, the epidemic in KwaZulu-Natal, the light orange line is the first wave, and the dark orange line is the second wave. As we look at the first wave, the cases went up in this part of the world to a peak and then down. I would call that something akin to Mount Kilimanjaro, compared to the second wave, which simply just continued to rise, reaching peaks more akin to what we've seen in Mount Everest. The difference between these two waves lies at the heart of what we have been witnessing in our hospitals. A rapid rise in cases, a very substantial burden, and now we are seeing the easing of that burden quite rapidly. When we look at other provinces, this is the Western Cape. This is the province where Cape Town is located. In the light green line is the first wave, compared to the second wave in the dark green line. One gets clarity about the way in which the new variants are spreading when we compare the first and second waves, and when we look at, in addition, to how rapidly it is spreading. So colleagues at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine have modeled this, and their estimates is that the 501Y V2 variant is spreading about 50% faster. From our own simple calculations, when we look at how long it has taken to reach 100,000 cases in each of the two provinces where where this variant is predominant, it took in the Western Cape 50% faster. The first wave, it took 107 days to get to 100,000 cases. Compare that to 54 days in the second wave. In KwaZulu-Natal, it was 39% faster, dropping from 54 days to 100,000 cases in the first wave to 33 days to 100,000 cases in the second wave. Of course, these comparisons are confounded by testing and behavior change and so on, but they give us some indication of the rapidity with which the virus is spreading in these two provinces. So let's go on to what do we know about the HIV and COVID-19 pandemics? What do the data indicate about their interrelationship? Well, we've noted that in many countries in Africa, that all of the resources and the capabilities that were built over the years for HIV could now be redirected and used in the response to COVID-19. Within South Africa, for example, we have established a very extensive and very substantial laboratory network to be able to do PCR testing for HIV, because HIV viral load testing is a key part of our armamentarium in dealing with HIV. All of that capability is the same platform that's used for COVID-19 PCR testing. And so we already had that. It didn't need to be built. The capacity to do those studies was ever present because of the HIV epidemic. Similarly, our community outreach programs. We have about 60,000 community healthcare workers in South Africa who go and visit patients with HIV in their homes as part of our outreach program for HIV. Similarly, with medical care access and research infrastructure, all of that was already available for HIV and could now be used for COVID-19. But COVID-19 has also had a dramatic effect on healthcare services, in particular for HIV and tuberculosis. What we have seen is during the lockdown period of the response to COVID-19, we saw a drop in the number of patients seeking care for HIV and tuberculosis. Fortunately, that impact was remedied and was undone as the lockdown was lifted. But still, we've seen the delays in HIV testing, we've seen the delays in monitoring viral loads, and of course the concerns we have is that that may foster viral resistance because we're not aware of those patients who have virological failure in HIV. So we've seen how the HIV infrastructure has had a positive benefit for COVID. We've also seen how COVID and its response has had a negative impact on HIV. What about the two diseases? There were all these predictions that HIV patients were going to have this severe epidemic. We want to see deaths in the hundreds of thousands. But very fortunately, that simply did not come to pass. In this study done in the UK, where they looked at cases of COVID-19 amongst those with and without HIV, there were only a small number of deaths in those who had HIV. And those were predominantly in individuals who were black, male, and deprived. But the overall difference was a 2.94 higher risk of death. Overall, it doesn't impact that much because the death rates in young people where HIV is common is very low. If one looks at South Africa, where in the Western Cape the impact of HIV has been estimated, it's been shown that HIV is associated with about a twofold higher risk of mortality. But that mortality is also associated with other comorbidities in these patients. And importantly, the overall attributable fraction of cases and deaths that occurred from COVID-19 as a result of HIV is quite small. And that's again principally because the deaths from COVID-19 occur largely in the elderly, where HIV is rare. Whereas where HIV is common in young people, there are very few deaths. So what we have seen is that the age mismatch between COVID-19 mortality and HIV prevalence has led to a situation where HIV has had minimal impact on COVID-19. So let me touch now on 5 key lessons that the HIV pandemic has taught us and assisted us in our COVID-19 response. I'll start off with the importance of science, the importance of knowing your epidemic and using that to define your response. I'm going to talk about the importance of leadership and leadership being consistent role models. I'll talk about the importance of having a prevention toolbox. And I'll go on to the importance of rapid testing before ending off on looking at the challenges that both pandemics present in terms of trying to achieve behavior change and trying to engage communities in altering their behavior. So let's start off with the scientific response. We've learned from HIV the importance of knowing your epidemic and using that to define your response. We have a whole range of documents and manuals that have been developed by the World Health Organization and UNAIDS that provide us with guidance about how to use data to fine-tune our HIV response. We draw maps like the one you see here that define the hotspots, identify where transmission is occurring highest. So we've used that in order to assist us in the way in which we've responded to COVID-19. What you are seeing here is a similar hotspot diagram from an area in Khayelitsha, just outside Cape Town. And this hotspot diagram showed us the importance of the grocery store in Khayelitsha as a source of virus that was seeding itself in the community. And as we've looked at the way in which this epidemic has panned out, we've been better able to understand what has worked and what hasn't. So the importance of the centrality of science and scientific evidence in the response is certainly one that has pervaded both pandemics. We saw its importance, for example, in the way in which we defined our response to HIV in creating our national strategic plans for HIV. Similarly, in South Africa, we created a very clear and systematic response, defined in 8 stages very early on in this pandemic to guide us. And we've used science, we've used our scientific knowledge of how the virus is spreading, and we've adjusted it accordingly. And that enabled us, in both instances, to have a scientifically based approach in the way in which we respond. But we know that we've always had challenges. In South Africa, we had challenges in the way in which we responded to HIV, when we had politicians that questioned whether a virus even caused HIV. We've seen similarly in countries like the US, where senior politicians begin to question the very fundamentals of the pandemic, and that creates confusion, whether it's through promoting unproven treatments like hydroxychloroquine, or whether it's in just denying the importance of the disease or its very existence. But we've also seen how conspiracy theories have challenged us, and how we've had to find our resolve and bring the best of our knowledge and scientific information to bear. In HIV, we saw that. In COVID-19, we saw that. Indeed, in an analysis done by Cornell University of 38 million articles, they found 1.1 million had misinformation. And the principal source of that misinformation, the principal source of those conspiracy theory, happened to be the President of the United States. So we've seen the importance of science. We've also know, and a lesson we've learned from HIV, is the importance of leadership, and the importance of consistent leadership, who not only say what is important, but also act on what they say, so that there's no dissonance between their words and their actions. And we saw that certainly from President Nelson Mandela in the way he responded to HIV. We've been very fortunate in our country that President Ramaphosa similarly has been a beacon of hope, has been one that's been always a very consistent individual, has shown leadership in the way we've responded. Because we've seen in the past how in HIV, in one of our neighboring countries, Eswatini, the king declared that there will be a vow of chastity, and then proceeded to break his own vow of chastity, for which he was punished. In the UK, we saw how Dominic Cummings was breaking the lockdown rules, the very rules he had been promoting. So creating this dissonance is quite important and undermines confidence from the public. The third lesson we found quite important in HIV is to draw on all of the tools, the prevention tools that are available. and then to pick from that toolbox those prevention mechanisms that are best suited to deal with each situation. So we know the importance of having this toolbox in HIV. Similarly, in COVID-19, we have a toolbox. We have a whole range of tools that we can use, whether it's testing and isolation, whether it's cloth masks, whether it's social distancing, vaccines. All of these tools are essential components of our response. And for each situation, we make our judgments as to which of those tools we want to use in order to prevent the spread of the virus. The fourth was we saw the importance in HIV of being able to diagnose somebody immediately. Having a rapid test that tells you whether you're positive or negative immediately is enormous. In HIV, it was a game changer. From the days in which it took 2 days to get a laboratory result to a situation where we had a result in 5 minutes. Because testing is a gateway to prevention, it's a gateway into treatment. And so everything that happens in following knowledge of status is critically important. Fortunately, in COVID-19, we're seeing a similar trend. It has taken us a long time to get from using the long PCR technology, which requires laboratory investigations, it takes a day, 2 days to get a result, to one where we have rapid tests now. We're using PCR technology, using lateral flow technology. We have simple antigen tests that can tell you whether you're positive in 5 minutes. So the importance of a rapid test to be able to diagnose somebody on the spot is critically important. And then finally, the fifth of the lessons we learned from HIV. And that is that there's this huge no-do gap. A lot of people understand, they have knowledge about how to protect themselves against HIV. They simply don't act on it. They simply are not changing their behavior in response to their own knowledge. And we know the importance of being able to enforce and enhance and facilitate behavior change. And we do that through a range of mechanisms, one of which is by engaging with communities in this process. And in COVID-19, we've certainly learned that. In South Africa, the Minister of Health created a ministerial advisory committee comprising community groups just to give him advice about how to respond. And we've similarly been developing community engagement strategies to try and encourage and facilitate behavior change, this time with masks instead of condoms. So I hope I've given you a sense of the 5 key things that we've learned from HIV that benefit the COVID-19 response. Let me end off with one of the key lessons from HIV. And I'll quote here from the book on how AIDS changed everything. The AIDS movement demonstrates that with a shared vision, shared responsibility, and through global solidarity and vision and leadership of people living with HIV, affected communities and individual action, we can change the course of history. And so in HIV, we saw global solidarity. We saw rich countries providing funding to organizations like the Global Fund, UNITAID, in order to provide treatment for those countries that could not afford it. We've seen a similar thing occur now in COVID-19, where COVAX, the vaccine facility, is being funded by rich countries in order to make vaccines available to poor countries. That global solidarity is key. And I cannot say it any better than Pope Francis in this editorial in the New York Times, when he said, "The pandemic has exposed the paradox that while we are more connected, we are also more divided. To come out of this crisis better, we need to recover the knowledge that as a people, we have a shared destination." The pandemic has reminded us that no one is saved alone. What ties us to one another is what we commonly call solidarity. Solidarity is more than the acts of generosity. Important as they are, it is a call to embrace the reality that we are bound by the bonds of reciprocity. On this solid foundation, we can build better, different human future. I would summarize it in my words in the phrase that I am safe because you are safe. You are safe because I am safe. It is our fundamental interdependence. And if we are to succeed against this pandemic, we are going to have to act in concert. We're going to have to stand together and face this pandemic together. Thank you very much.
As we wage a war against the coronavirus, many have likened our current context to the Great Depression. In fact, global economic growth for 2020 is expected to show its sharpest drop since the end of the Second World War, while the rate of unemployment has climbed exponentially. Admittedly, this downward trend is not expected to last long, and our economic know-how has certainly advanced since the 1930s. Still, we fared better in the 2008-2009 global financial crisis than we did last year. Yet this week, it emerged that China has bucked the trend. While there are expectations that global growth contracted by 4.3%, the world's second largest economy expanded by 2.3% in the year 2020. What is remarkable is that although this is a 4-decade low for China, the growth figure still surpassed initial forecasts. Despite great uncertainty for the rest of the world in 2021, the prospects for China look promising. The Chinese Academy of Social Sciences estimates that the economy will grow 7.8%, which would be China's strongest performance in 9 years. The coronavirus pandemic has certainly shaken our world order, but we are also in the midst of another transformation. As the coronavirus shifted from an endemic to a pandemic, the pace of digital transformation we have seen in recent years has hastened. We find ourselves thrust into the fourth industrial revolution, an era encompassed by technology such as artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and 3D printing, for instance. Simply put, we find ourselves in an era where intelligent technologies permeate all aspects of our lives, be they in the economy, society, or politics, which is envisioned to potentially grow economies exponentially. We have seen tangible examples of this in recent months, all along with masks, constant sanitizing, and physical distancing. We have had to adopt new ways of learning, working, worshipping, and even socializing. The likes of Zoom and Microsoft Teams have in a sense become our social lifelines. We conduct meetings, attend funerals and weddings, and check in with our families on these platforms. So entrenched are the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution that nations are creating strategies In line with them, regulations are being overhauled, and our lives and careers are fundamentally being redefined. Businesses are looking to technology as a solution, and in a natural progression of cost-cutting and automation, many people are being replaced. These are changes we anticipated and feared with the advent of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. This digital transformation, of course, is one of the key drivers of growth in China, which is said to be emerging as the world's first AI superpower. In fact, on its current trajectory, it is projected that China's economy will surpass the US economy in the next 5 years. With the impact of the coronavirus and the lockdowns it has necessitated, the government has attempted to spur growth through major infrastructure projects and by offering cash handouts to stimulate spending among citizens. Yet more than this, growth has been driven by industrial production. According to Bloomberg, much of this growth can be attributed to the increased demand for medical equipment and work-from-home devices in an export bonanza that saw it ship 224 billion masks from March through December, almost 40 for every man, woman, and child on the planet outside of China. Despite headwinds from the US under President Donald Trump, China made strides in 2020 by securing a trade deal with 14 Asia-Pacific nations and an investment accord with the European Union. Of course, there are still glaring gaps in the growth strategy. While industrial production rose by 2.8%, retail sales fell by 3.9%. As is the case with much of the rest of the world, domestic consumption dropped as workers had to reduce spending and income inequalities widened. There are, however, lessons to be learned when compared to the grim global picture. In part, China's economic success is because the coronavirus was relatively contained by the time other nations took a knock. However, it must be acknowledged that the shift towards industrializing the Chinese economy in recent decades and a willingness to adopt technology has buoyed the economy through global turbulence. When we zone back into the South African context, the picture is vastly different. According to the medium-term budget, National Treasury expects the economy to contract by 7.8% in 2020. The Reserve Bank is slightly more pessimistic with projections of an 8% contraction. Already the country shed more than 2.2 million jobs between April and June last year when we underwent our hardest lockdown period. The number for the year is expected to be at least 1 million more. In fact, we are worse off than many other nations. This is largely because we are already in an economic downturn before COVID-19 hit our shores, leaving us particularly vulnerable. Admittedly, it has been a decade of tepid growth. Davi Ruot, the director and chief economist at Efficient Group, was quoted in Business Day in December as saying, and I quote, "This is a depression we are in, not a recession. A recession is a cyclical downturn, but a depression is when the economy is fundamentally broken and this economy is broken." Close quote. This implies that we are now forced to rethink our strategy to revitalize our economy. As President Cyril Ramaphosa said earlier this year, we have to decisively change the face of South Africa's economy and not simply allow it to return to where it was before the devastating COVID-19 pandemic. Our task is not only to build back better, but also build forward differently. To bring about this change, we need a radical program of action that is restorative, that rebuilds, and that is transformative, President Ramaphosa said. But what does this mean? If we are to emulate some of China's success, we must see the value in embracing the Fourth Industrial Revolution. In South Africa, we have established a national Fourth Industrial Revolution strategy, though so far we have done little in the way of implementation. The economic potential is difficult to ignore. According to a PwC study, AI could contribute up to $15.7 trillion to the global economy in 2030, which is more than the current output in China and India combined. Of this, $6.6 trillion is likely to come from increased productivity, and $9.1 trillion is likely to come from consumption side effects. According to Accenture, organizations that strategically implement AI technologies see an increase in labor productivity, develop new products at an accelerated rate while eliminating redundant costs, and have the potential to boost profitability by as much as 37%. Yet, when we hone into the South African context, there are various impediments. In 2019, a report from Microsoft and tax advisory service EY found that nearly 46% of South African companies say they are already actively piloting AI within their organizations. Over the past 10 years, South Africa's overall investment in AI has been $1.6 billion. However, we are still lagging behind significantly. A report from Accenture in 2017 found that South Africa had numerous structural deficiencies, hampering the integration of new technologies into the economy. The management consulting company found that our education systems, from primary to university levels, and scientific research institutions were weak, while there was little in the way of innovation ecosystems at a national level, coupled with poor enabling infrastructure to support growth. This is, of course, against the backdrop of a weak economy, low levels of trust, and sinking business confidence. The report reads, South Africa is facing myriad structural and cultural hurdles, as well as social dilemmas, which may hamper or delay businesses and governments from fully integrating AI technologies into the economy, ultimately impacting the potential upside to growth and competitiveness that AI presents. The set 8 of recommendations made by the Presidential Commission on the Fourth Industrial Revolution envision to revitalize the economy and tackle the structural deficiencies. We are subverting the very notion that we are unprepared for this fundamental global paradigm shift. The first recommendation is to invest in human capital, as the concern around human irrelevancy and job losses arise. A comprehensive view of the entire human capital system must be developed, and the leverage points which can be accelerated by 4IR need to be identified. There should be a focus on communication, logical and numerical skills from a school level. These skills should feed into the ability to code, think computationally, and have a holistic approach to problem solving. This investment can be scaled for exponential skills pipeline development and market absorption. Achieving this leads into the second recommendation, which calls for the establishment of the National Artificial Intelligence Institute that focuses on the application of AI to health, agriculture, finance, mining, manufacturing, and government, as well as regulations. It will be responsible for supporting capacity building in neural networks, natural language processing, and computer vision, among others. To spur the industrial and research applications of AI, we need to make high-performance computing available for widespread use. This institute will focus on research and development, as well as implementation capabilities in AI. A mandate to include training will bolster the investment in human capital. The third recommendation is to establish a platform for advanced manufacturing and new materials. In the context of the 4IR, it needs to be supported by a state-led initiative to grow the sector and develop and apply new materials through the technologies of the 4IR. The fourth recommendation is to secure and avail data to enable innovation. This is critical for building e-government services across sectors such as health, transport, and justice. This could be achieved through the creation of the National Data Center, which consolidate the available computational power and create a national data center that will become the national data repository for all our data, including health data. This can be done alongside existing data center companies. However, cybersecurity needs to be bolstered in order to safeguard the public. The fifth recommendation is to incentivize future industries and platforms and applications of 4IR technologies. This means that companies should be incentivized to use 4IR technologies to improve South Africa's competitiveness. These incentives should include tax breaks and support for research and development using organizations such as the CSIR, the NRF, the MRC, and the ARC. The sixth recommendation is to build 4IR infrastructure which integrates with existing economic and social infrastructure. We need to look at the generation and delivery of energy, the extension and improvement of water infrastructure and health and educational infrastructure to create a coherent and comprehensive infrastructure network. The first step will be for government to develop a comprehensive set of infrastructure priorities for the country with achievable timelines. The seventh recommendation is to review, amend, or create policy and legislation. In order to ensure our legislations are in line with the 4IR, Parliament should look at all our legislation and update them in line with 4IR. This will require the legislature and the state executives to be trained to become 4IR and science literate to implement changes. Finally, the eighth recommendation is to establish a 4IR strategy implementation coordination council in the presidency which will coordinate government departments responsible for the 4IR related programs. In addition to this, the council will coordinate initiatives across the public and private sectors, labor and academia. As we navigate our way through the post-COVID world and find ourselves thrust deeper into the 4IR, our policies and systems must speak to our current context. As World Bank Group President David Malpass tells us, and I quote, "To overcome the impacts of the pandemic and counter the investment headwind, there needs to be a major push to improve business environments, increase labor and product market flexibility, and strengthen transparency and governance," close quote. Achieving this in South Africa, I would argue, is dependent on the implementation of our 4IR blueprint. This requires decision-making that is not only visionary, but is also able to secure our future for coming generations and our survival. As Ronald Reagan said of the Great Depression, and I quote, "To be young in my generation was to feel that your future had been mortgaged out under you, and that is a tragic mistake we must never allow our leaders to make again," close quote. I thank you. Ngiyabonga. Bayadanki.